So one of the first things that I notice whenever somebody picks up a new camera or they get a new camera or they're wanting to pursue photography, videography, YouTube, they want to get into this kind of camera world, is that they start to use auto settings from the start. Now sure, auto settings you can get by with for a little while, but eventually you do have to click this over into manual. It's going to give you a lot more control and it's going to make your footage and your photos look a lot better. But when you swap to manual mode, it can be fairly overwhelming. You have ISO, aperture, frame rates, shutter speed. You have so many settings to kind of keep in your mind. It's a lot. Now in this video, I'm going to explain the top 3 camera settings that you need to know to 1, make your videos and photos just way better, and 2, to actually get to know your camera, get to know what it can do, get to know what it can't do, and that way you can apply it in certain situations, whatever you're doing, whatever you're using your camera in. That way you know what this thing can do, and you have more confidence using it. So, let's dive into it. Hey there, my name's Jaren, and this channel is all about production hacks and tips and tricks and how to make your videos look better. We also talk about the social media space, the YouTube space, and some tips on how to grow on that. So if any of that interests you at all, please feel free to hit that subscribe button. We'll greatly appreciate it. And just so you know, I'm going to be talking about these camera settings in relation to video, not so much photography. It's going to be more video based, just because that's what I do. I'm not necessarily a photographer. I definitely specialize more with video than I do photo, but we'll talk a little bit about photo as well. But this is definitely going to be geared more toward the video side of things. All right, so there are 3 main settings that you need to know called the exposure triangle. These 3 settings are going to help you to get the best exposure possible in your photos and video. So let's talk about ISO first. Now, in every camera, there is a sensor. It kind of looks like that. That is the sensor that you'll see in pretty much every camera. Your ISO is basically this sensor's sensitivity to light. Now, ISO will range from 100 to over 6,000 and even beyond that. And if you're working with a lot of light, like you have a lot of natural light, you have studio lights you're working with, you don't need to worry about lighting, well then you can lower your ISO as much as you need to. You can lower it down to 100. I have mine at 160 right now to film this video, so I have a lot of light coming in at the moment, so don't need to raise it too much. Now, on the flip side, if you don't have a lot of light, what ISO can do in raising that ISO number, that helps to create digital light. This can be really helpful if you're shooting in low light situations, either at night or in a dim room, where you don't have control of any light at all. So you raise that ISO to kind of help to mitigate for the low light situation. Now, one thing to be careful of when it comes to raising that ISO is you don't want to raise it too high. Because if you raise it too high, you're going to start to introduce what's called noise. This is that digital grain that you see in a lot of poorly lit photos and videos. It's basically this kind of like grainy film texture that you kind of see, like it's like a vintage kind of vibe, but it doesn't really look good unless you edit it in post. So it's something to kind of stay away from. But yeah, that's essentially ISO in a nutshell. It's a sensitivity to light. It can add a little digital light if you need it, but you don't want to go too overboard. So that's ISO in a nutshell. All right, let's talk shutter speed. In your camera, there's a shutter that opens and closes. Now, you can control how fast and how long that shutter stays open. Now, shutter speed is most likely in fractions of a second, so it's that fraction number that you see on your camera, so it's like 1 over some number. That's your shutter speed. So for example, if you're shooting in photography and you want to shoot something that is it's just frozen in time, you just want to freeze time, you want to capture this static moment, no motion, nothing like that, then you want a fairly fast shutter speed. 1/250th of a second. Like, that's faster than I could probably blink my eyes. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, I don't think I could blink my eyes that fast. Now, on the flip side, if you want to shoot something that does have a little bit of motion to it, you want to add a little bit of blur to your photo, you can raise the time that shutter stays open, so you can keep it open for half a second, a full second, whatever it may be, whatever you need to do to kind of get that motion. It's something to kind of play around with, especially with photography. Now, that's shutter speed for photography, but for video, it's a little bit different. For video, there is a specific rule that we need to follow. The rule is that our shutter speed needs to be double our frame rate. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into frame rates because that could be a whole video in of itself, but basically you're probably shooting at 1080 HD 30p. That means you're shooting at 30 frames per second, or shooting at 4K 30. that's 4K at 30 frames per second, or 1080p 60 frames per second, that's 60 frames per second. Now you're most likely shooting at either 24, 30, or 60 frames per second. Those are the top 3 frame rates you're probably going to be using. And the rule for shutter speed is whatever frame rate you're using, so we're using 30 frames per second, is that your shutter speed needs to be double that of your frame rate. So our shutter speed is 1/60 since we're shooting at 30 frames per second. Now let's say, for example, I was shooting a video of something that was fast moving, let's say a sporting event, let's say basketball. I'm shooting this video of basketball players going up and down the court, and so I want probably some more frames so I can capture some more moments and more images, so I'm probably going to be shooting at 60 frames per second in this video. Now since I'm shooting this sporting event at 60 frames per second, my shutter speed would be 1/120. So just the basic rule of thumb is if you're trying to figure out what shutter speed you should use for your video, just look at your frame rate and double that. Pretty simple. Again, the whole thing with shutter speed is that we're trying to capture motion blur. That's the main thing. We're trying to capture as natural of a motion blur to what we see with our eyes. We're trying to capture that as much as possible with our camera, and this is kind of the general rule of thumb that people have come up with. And the thing is, if we set our shutter speed too low, like 1/15, then we're gonna be jumping frames. It's not gonna look good. And then if we set our shutter speed too fast, it's gonna be tough to really see any motion, any movement really happening. It kind of feels like your footage is a little bit slower since there's no motion blur. So I know that was a little bit long, but I hope that all made sense. All right, let's move on to my favorite setting, Aperture. Aperture is the only setting that is controlled in your lens. Let me show you what I mean with this manual lens. So do you see that wheel opening and closing in the lens? That's the aperture wheel. Now aperture controls 2 main things. The first of those things being how much light is being let into the lens. So if that aperture wheel is open all the way, it's letting as much light in as the lens can into the camera and to the sensor. And then if it's closed all the way, it's letting in very minimal amount of light into the camera. The second thing that aperture controls is the background blur. When this wheel is as open as it can be, you're going to be popping your subject from the background. The background's going to be a little bit more blurred, and your subject is really going to pop in the frame. Now, how is aperture measured? Well, it's measured in what's called f-stops, and it's that decimal number that you see on your camera. Now, the lower that decimal point, the wider and the more open that aperture wheel can get. And not only that, but the lower that number, the more light that can be let into the camera, and the more background blur you can get. Now, we want to be careful when we lower that number too much. There are lenses out there that can get down to 1.2, f1.2. That is crazy. When you lower your aperture that much to 1.2, what happens is what's in focus, it's a tighter window of what's in focus. This is what's in focus at f8. A lot's in focus. The background's in focus, your subject's in focus, everything's in focus. At f1.8, you only have, 1.8, 1.2, you only have a little bit that's in focus. So again, when you're at that f1.2 and it's that low, you're gonna run into a situation where your nose will be in focus, but your ears won't be. Now, this low aperture, what's nice about it is you do get this nice bokeh effect. That's kind of the blurry background, that cinematic feel that everybody's going after. So that's kind of the goal with aperture, and that's kind of the idea of this kind of bokeh effect, is it gives you more background blur and it pops your subject from your background. Now, let's talk about a hypothetical real quick where you are, let's say you're vlogging outside. You're like, yo, YouTube, what's up? You're vlogging outside, you're doing your thing, right? Everything is, you followed all the rules of exposure, your ISO is low, your shutter speed is double the frame rate, and your aperture is wide open. You're at, f, whatever your lens can go, whatever low, this can go to 3.5. So if this is at f3.5, you're as low as it can go, and it looks, all the exposure settings are what it should be. But your video is blown out, it's too bright. So what do? Well, there's a couple things we could do. One, our ISO is already as low as it can go, so we can't adjust that. We could raise our shutter speed. We could make that shutter go a little bit faster, to do more than double, but at the same time, we're gonna be missing out on our motion blur is not gonna be there. It's not gonna be natural. It's gonna feel very slow, and it's not gonna look that great. We also could close the aperture, but everything is going to be in focus, and you're going to miss out on that nice bokeh effect. You're not going to have that nice background blur, and it's just kind of everything's going to blend in together. It's going to be exposed, but it's probably not going to look the way it's not going to be that nice cinematic experience that you probably bought that lens for. Now, this is kind of a bonus thing, but the one thing that you probably want to invest in is an ND filter. This is a polarized ND filter that acts as basically sunglasses for your camera. Now this can get even darker here. So there, now you can probably see the reflection of my windows and oh, there's the camera. You could even see the reflection of yourself. There you go, boom. But yeah, I mean, an ND filter, basically you can, you know, kind of screw this to the front of your camera lens. Now this is for my Sony that I'm filming with right now, but you screw this to the front of your lens and it acts as sunglasses, which is pretty cool. It's really nice so that you could actually maintain your camera settings, that nice low aperture, so you get that nice bokeh effect going on, and also to where you don't have to mess with the shutter speed, and that motion blur looks nice and natural, and so everything is properly exposed. You have a nice ND filter. I would highly recommend getting this if you shoot outdoors. If you're shooting outdoors a lot, this is definitely something you probably should invest in, because this can be really helpful. Now this is one of the cheaper ND filters that I found on Amazon. I think it was like 35 bucks. Let me know if you want to see a review video on it. I kind of want to do one, so I might just make one anyway. But we'll make an ND filter video and check this out. See if it makes a difference. So excited to see that. Wow. Okay, that was a lot. There was a lot to cover there. If you're kind of thinking like, Jaren, that was a lot. It was. That was quite a bit. Now, if you're still feeling kind of confused and a little overwhelmed, don't worry. That is completely normal. This was a lot to cover in one video. I did put timestamps down below in the description on this video. So if you need to go back and refresh your memory on shutter speed or ISO or aperture, whatever you want to go back to refresh your memory on, you could go back to and kind of use this as a resource. And if you're still confused after that and you have some questions, be sure to put them in, post them down in the comments below. I would be more than happy to answer your questions. But yeah, that's pretty much gonna do it. I hope this was helpful to you. I don't know if I hope I explained things okay. I hope I made it as simple as possible. I know it could get kind of confusing, but I hope I made that simple. Again, any questions, leave them down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate you guys. If you want to see more content like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. We'd greatly appreciate it. Alrighty, thanks so much for watching. Appreciate you. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.